Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture in Chapter 13, the Rule of Charlemagne. So in this chapter, we're going to actually take a look at Middle Ages Europe. You might hear it called medieval times, or like the Dark Ages as a name. But we're going to start looking into Europe in the years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and we'll do that here in the next two chapters, 13 and 14. All right, so as you can tell, the rule of Charlemagne, we're going to focus on his rule and the rise of the Franks. So this one's mostly going to be talking about um, what led to the rise of the Frankish kingdom to become an important state in Western Europe, and then obviously go through the rule of Charlemagne himself. So let's get started. All right, so let's set the stage. So the Middle Ages is the period known between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance. Essentially, that's the age that we're talking about here. It's about 1,000-year period, depending on what date you really want to look at. But essentially, three things are very important that happen, and I would make sure you star these, remember them. Is there's a new society that emerges with these three traits. They have the classical heritage of Rome, so there's a linking back to the Western Roman Empire. There's also the beliefs in the Roman Catholic Church. Religion is going to become very, very powerful during this time. It will wane towards the end because of the Black Death, but we'll get into that a little bit more towards the end of chapter 14. But then you also mix it with the customs of Germanic tribes that move into Western Europe. Western and Central Europe, and we'll talk about some of these reasons here today and moving forward. All right, so the invasions of Western Europe are really, really important to understand how Europe is going to develop itself. Well, one of the reasons why the Western Roman Empire falls, and then how Western Europe is going to develop in the centuries afterwards. So by the 5th century, there's Germanic tribes that are overrunning the Western Roman Empire in a variety of ways. There's some that are coming in as enemies directly, and then there's others that are coming in who have been invited into the Roman Empire to fight as soldiers for them, and so forth. And eventually they take over in kind of a most basic statement of that instance. But if you want to know more about that, it's pretty interesting. So there's some changes that take place. One, there's a disruption in trade. This is very important because the economic structure of Western Europe, which was controlled by the Roman Empire for such a long period of time, starts to collapse. So businesses fail. Access to wealth isn't as prevalent across the entirety of the empire. You also start to see a downfall of cities. So cities start to become places that people don't want to be in because they see that they're being attacked. A lot of Germanic tribes are focusing on cities because they have the resources, they have the wealth, they want to plunder, and so forth. Because of the downfall of cities, disruption in trade in these attacks, you see population shifts. People are starting to abandon the cities. So what Europe, in particular the western part, shifts from a more urban society to more rural, which means that you're going to spread people out, and people are going to be less connected. And because of this, you're going to see a decline in learning. Also, mainly you're going to see a decline in learning because the Germanic tribes didn't typically have a reading or writing system. Most of the time, their language systems were just verbal. They weren't something that you wrote down. So there's kind of this loss of knowledge there. And then there's a loss of common language, which is a problem initially, but moving forward as education gets in, and areas become more defined and people gain control of certain areas, this actually will become a benefit. And this is actually what will lead to your development of different languages that exist in Europe today, like French, Spanish, Italian, German, and so forth. And this is going to happen because of the mix of cultures. All right, so this is just a kind of a quick map. You guys will get a similar one to this, a little bit more detailed on your test for chapter 13. And this just kind of shows the number of invasion routes from the different groups of people going throughout Europe, or really the invasions of the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, and when it fell. And you can see that we're going to mainly focus on the Franks today. We've talked about the Huns a little bit previously in chapter 11. We're going to talk some about the Goths, and so forth. And the ones that you don't see here are the Vikings, because the Vikings are going to come a little bit later after the purpose of this map. But they do play a role in some of the things that we're talking about here, just in the later stages after the fall of the Roman Empire. All right, so decline in learning and language. This is something that's very, very important for you guys to understand. We've kind of already talked about a lot of this stuff on the previous slide, but just to kind of reiterate it. So typically when a population becomes more rural, learning is less prevalent. And you actually see this. This isn't me taking a shot at anybody in areas that are more rural, even in this country, the United States. Typically, education is a lot. It's not necessarily as high as you see in more urban areas, where it's not as valued in certain instances. But again, that's not a shot at anybody that lives in a rural area. It typically in its most basic sense you see that. And the case remains the same here in Europe, particularly because you don't have the instant communication that like we have today. So people are less connected to learning. All right, so what ends up happening is the priests and other church officials become the center for education. They're really the only source that can actually read and write in Europe at this time, because you have people being spread out. You have Germanic tribes coming in settling down in various areas like France or Switzerland or wherever you want to pick in Europe. And the church is really going to be the only source for learning. You do, however, have the Germanic tribes bringing in their traditions, their stories. They're just oral. Like I said on the last slide, they don't have a written language. Most of them don't anyways. And then with all of these interactions that are going to take place, like we talked about on the previous slide, you're going to see those oral traditions, those groups of people mix with Latin, which was spoken by the Romans, and it's going to change, and you're going to develop different dialects and different languages. So like in the case of the Romanic languages, which were based off of Latin, you see the development of the differences in terms of French, Spanish, Italian. They all have the same root in Latin and the main Roman language, but they diverge because of these Germanic tribes coming in and mixing and creating different dialects. All right, so you have a changing government. So the church, again, just like it's the center for learning, it's going to become the center for order and security, mainly because where do most people turn to in times of need, specifically in this period? They're going to turn towards religion. There's a lot of money, really the economic base that's really only there. Or the group that's able to maintain it the best is the church, because people are so focused in the religion. You also see that Germanic tribes, they're typically smaller, or if they're even bigger, they're more focused on smaller entities. So you're more focused on like the family unit or smaller communities, which is an exact opposite of Rome, which was more city-based, more bigger government-based. And you see more of a focus on loyalty, and people would fight to the death for this. Think of this again as a similarity to what we talked about in chapter 10 with like the Bedouins, where the Islamic culture came out of. Same thing here. Germanic cultures, harsh life, warrior type system. Some are nomadic, some are semi-nomadic. There's a lot of loyalty there and high military skill, which is one of the reasons why they're able to defeat the Roman Empire, and why a lot of them were actually welcomed to the empire and hired as soldiers. So that idea of Germanic loyalty to the family is a big deal here. I need you guys to star this or remember this last point on your notes, is that the idea of a loyalty to the family in this instance of looking at the smaller unit means that it's going to be very, very difficult, next to impossible, for any ruler in Western Europe to control large amounts of territory. And that is going to be very important, because if you guys look at Europe, it's not actually all that large. It's pretty big, but it's not large compared to, like, Russia, China, the United States, Canada. And it's broken up. And one of the reasons why it's fairly broken up to this day is because of this instance here. And you have these developments moving forward that create different cultures. All right, so we're going to move to the Franks here for the last half of this lecture. Like I said, it's titled The Rule of Charlemagne, but that was all the stuff that kind of helped set the stage for talking about the Franks here in Western Europe. So the Franks were a group of people that actually settled in Gaul. Gaul is mostly present day France, and what was known by the Roman Empire. Their first real significant leader that we want to talk about here is Clovis. Now, Clovis is important because he brings Christianity to the region and to the Frankish kingdom. He baptizes his army and and by doing that, it's a smart move because it means that he can actually have connection with the Christian church in Rome. And the reason why that's important for him is that now he has an economic backer. The main economic entity in Western Europe is the church, and they're the strongest. So if he needs money to pay his soldiers and so forth to make sure his campaigns are going through, he allies himself with the church. It's a powerful alliance because not only is he able to gain control of the region of Gaul and establish a very powerful kingdom for the Franks, but he's also helping with expanding the power of the church by helping with converts, helping beat people that are against the religion and so forth. So it's a really good alliance there between the two. And this means that all Franks are going to be united under one kingdom in 511, starting the Frankish kingdom and then eventually the Frankish Empire. All right, so these two things go in hand. As the Frankish Empire rises, or Frankish kingdom rises and becomes one under Clovis, you have to also talk about the rise of Christianity. And we've kind of mentioned this a little bit already with the fact, where do people look to? They look to the church because there's difficult times. It's the economic power. But as this merger comes together, it allows for missionaries of the church to be sent throughout Western Europe more safely, or with Frankish armies. And that means more Germanic tribes are going to be converting to Christianity. So again, building that power base. There's also many that convert specifically in the Iberian Peninsula and in southern Gaul because they're afraid that they're going to get attacked by Muslims, either crossing the Mediterranean Sea or coming up through the Iberian Peninsula. You see that since the church itself is the only real rich area, they're still getting money. They start building monasteries and churches throughout Western Europe. They become very prevalent, which means that you have religious communities that are taking up. You have more access to religion for people to come to, and it strengthens the religion itself. During this time, you see the set of, under Saint Benedict, he sets out the Benedictine rule, which is a strict set of rules that dictate monastery life. So the church itself is becoming more organized in specific areas, in this case, Italy, for Saint Benedict. And then also remember, you got to go back to the fact that the only real source of education and learning is with the churches, because they maintain that with the breakup that's brought by the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Germanic invasions. So monasteries become the centers for education. One example, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about this when we watch the documentary The Dark Ages, is Bede's History of England. He writes this large volume work about the history of England, and it's a significant example of showing where the actual education is, and it's in the church system at this time. All right, so this also, adding to the growing power of the church, they have an army in the Frankish kingdom that is actually backing them and helping with power. You see the Pope's power in Rome expand. In particular instance, we have to talk about Pope Gregory. He becomes Pope in 590, and what he tries to do and sets out to do are these three things on the screen. It works to expand papal power, so it becomes more involved in politics. So it actually becomes a secular body, or at least a part of it. So now you have a religious group that is working the religion, but they also have a part of them that is working in the actual realm of politics. And that's kind of linked to that idea of the alliance with the Franks as an example. He also sets out to use the money for the church to help build roads, help poor, raising armies. And that's important. Repairing roads for a number of reasons. It allows people to get to you. It also allows for economic things to get done much more easily. Helping the poor means that you're not only helping those people in a most basic sense and carrying out certain duties of the Christian religion, but it also means that if those people aren't themselves actually Christian, they're more likely to convert to Christianity. And then obviously raising armies and using them to help either the spread of Christianity, spread of church power, or helping to keep outside issues away. And then he viewed that papal authority stretched from Italy to England, so Italy in the south all the way to England in the north, and then from Spain in the west to Germany in the east. So basically what we're talking about here is all of Western Europe, and kind of moving a little bit into Central Europe. He viewed that that was itself, the Pope had authority over that entire area. And this is what you're seeing with the expansion of Christianity in this area itself. All right, so back to the Franks again. So their first famous ruler for the Franks is Charles Martel. He gets the nickname Charles the Hammer. And he was a very effective leader. He was able to expand Frankish territory and control it more into Central Europe, so more into Germany, more into like places like Austria and so forth, in some campaigns. But what he's most known for is that he defeated the Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732. And you need to know this date. I don't ask you to know many dates in this class, but this is one that you have to remember. And the reason why 732 is important is because of this battle, and it essentially preserves Christian Europe. If the Frankish forces under Charles Martel lose at the Battle of Tours in 732, we probably aren't Christian today. Like West European based groups are probably Muslim. Okay, if you think about that in terms of history. Now, after Charles Martel dies, he's succeeded by Pepin the Short, and Pepin fights for the church. He brings that alliance even more closely together between the Pope and Rome and the Frankish kingdom. And this is important because this establishes the Carolingian dynasty. And this is the most important dynasty within the Frankish Empire's history. So you have Charles the Hammer, Pepin the Short, and then moving forward, subsequent rulers. Now, this is a very famous painting. This is a painting of Charles Martel here. You can see him in the center, fighting back the Muslim forces, and you can kind of see this is a very romanticized version to show that he's protecting all of Christianity as well as protecting women and children, as you can see here. And you have a Muslim soldier coming after him, and then protecting the cross and so forth. So this is a very romanticized version of the Battle of Tours. It's not how it happened, but very famous painting nonetheless. Okay, now Charlemagne, he's the title man for this lecture. Most important ruler of this period in Western Europe. Most important ruler, obviously, for the Frankish Empire as well. But he was able to build the largest or greatest empire in Western Europe since Rome. And that's an important step considering what happened in the several hundred years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You hadn't had anybody that really could do that. And I'll show you what his empire went to expand here in just a second. But he was able to conquer Muslim lands, specifically in the Iberian Peninsula and what is today Spain and parts of Portugal. And he was able to expand eastward and take over many more Germanic lands and get people to convert to Christianity. So you see a spreading of Christianity all across Western Europe, and it's strengthening its hold across, amongst many of the people that are there, if not all in some regions. And this leads to him to become very, very closely connected with the church, and he is crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in Rome. So the Holy Emperor of the new Roman Empire, in a sense. And the Holy Roman Empire will exist moving forward. Power base will shift more towards Germany and Italy, but it will exist moving forward. All right, this is Charlemagne's empire. So the green territory here is what was under his control when he actually came to the Frankish throne. And then by his death in 814, and by the way, he's starting to come into contact in 814 with Viking raiders. So this is kind of the period that the Vikings are coming into play in terms of invading Europe, just to kind of have you guys link back to chapter 11. But by his death in 814, you add those orange areas, and then you have some areas that they actually marched into that didn't necessarily take control of. But this is a significant empire. That's a large portion of Western Europe. I mean, it's most of France, it's all of Belgium and the Netherlands, a significant portion of Germany, as well as northern and central Italy, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, and into Austria and so forth, and even maybe into the Czech Republic a little bit today, just to kind of give you an understanding of what we're looking at if you were to lay over the borders of Europe, today's borders. All right, This is a little bit clearer map to kind of have you guys understand. This is on the day or the year of Charlemagne's death. You can see the Frankish Empire here is right here. You have the Emirate of Cordova. This is Muslim territory. You have the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, and then the Abbasid Caliphate that we've already talked about. And then you've got various Russian groups, and you have the Vikings that are starting to kind of come together, and they're starting to raid into Western Europe and then into Eastern Europe as well. All right. So just a couple slides here. So Charlemagne's rule and succession are really important. So in his rule, he was a very, very strong military commander. That's obvious given the fact that he was able to expand the empire so well. But he started to restrict noble authority within the Frankish Empire itself, more centering on him. He was somebody that was very active in his rulership. He traveled throughout his empire, didn't really stay in too many places all the time, or one place too often. He was very effective in creating a system of royal agents or a government bureaucracy to actually help him govern over such a large area. It's one of the reasons why he was able to rule such a large empire by the standards of the day. He was somebody that was very well focused and supportive in education. He actually couldn't read or write initially, and then undertook an education so he could. Think about that. He's one of the very few kings in this age that actually could read and write. Because our education was so put on the back burner in terms of the basic education that we value today. But he undertook that. He set up learning programs to go across the empire. This also helped strengthen the power and connection with the church, because, you know, they're the only real source of education. He's helping with that. Plus, people can read, and what are they going to turn and typically read to? They're going to read the Bible, because that's the most copied book in this time by hand. Now, when he dies in 814, like I said, there's a new threat on his lands. The Vikings are coming in, and they have to deal with that. But power passes to his son, Louis the Pious. He's a very religious son. And he proves to be a very ineffective ruler. And what ends up happening is 3 of Charlemagne's sons, including Louis, start to fight over who should really control the empire itself. And based on an old Frankish tradition that you'd split your lands amongst your sons, but Charlemagne tried to get rid of that. But ultimately what this does is it ends up with the Treaty of Verdun, and they agree to split the empire into 3 different areas. And what this does is this sets up and causes the feudalism, to develop in Europe. And Europe from this point is actually going to kind of divulge itself, break up into various little kingdoms led by different rulers, and really going to fragment the entirety of Western Europe for quite some time. This picture. We have a picture and a map, and then we're done. This picture is in Aachen. It's a church in Aachen. It's I'm sorry, it's not a church in Aachen. It's Charlemagne's throne room. Aachen was his capital. Aachen is still a very, very important city to this day in Western Germany. It's very close to the French and Belgian borders. And then here, this is where Aachen is, by the way. And then this is what happens with the Frankish Empire with the Treaty of Verdun. You can see Charlemagne's son Charles gets what we would call mainly France today. You see that Lotharius, he gets the middle area, and then Louis, he gets what we would consider like Germany and Austria today. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. I know this one was a long one. There's a lot of information. This is a very, very important lecture to focus on moving forward, not only for this chapter as a whole, but also for stuff in chapter 14, and then a little bit into chapter 17 when we kind of revisit the end of the Dark Ages and move on to the Renaissance. All right, guys, have a good one.